Well, good to be here with everyone. See visitors. Welcome. If I end up in a coughing spasm while I'm up here, George will jump up and kick my carcass off the stage and lead a few more psalms, and by then maybe I'll be in better shape again. So Leah's preaching in Canastota this morning. They're going to Tennessee, and they will be back a week from tomorrow is the plan. Next week, Dan Bunting plans to be here with us to teach class and bring a lesson. Today, since we're going to move into the book of James after we finish Hebrews, when Lee gets back, we'll do the introduction to the book of James today. And you can try to keep it all in mind, the part that's worthwhile anyway, for a couple weeks down the road or months down the road, whenever it is that we start. I think Lee said probably the end of May. He thought he'd be done with the book of Hebrews. I think he could take another 6 months, so far as I'm concerned. It's a really good study. That's why I did not want to take it on, because I knew he'd do a really good job with it. So, but we're going to look at the book of James. So, and just a quick outline of what we're going to try to cover today. We'll look at who the author is, the context of it being written, kind of the date, and I don't know if anything is certain on any date. When it comes right down to things, that's what happens when you change calendars every couple thousand years. The subject of the book, and then a few other miscellaneous things about the book. And if there's time at the end, I'll just, when I finish this stuff, we'll maybe just read through the whole thing. It really, you can read through the book of James in 10 minutes. It's really not that long, but it is packed with a lot of material. So, the author, James, obvious enough, right? The question is, which James? There are 4 James that I could find in the Bible. I saw a reference that said there are 5 Jameses, and then after I put together my notes and everything else, then I came across another reference that said there are 6 people named James in the Bible. So 2 of them are still kind of unknown to me. Didn't have time to search who those are. So King James is not one of them, right? Why not, Ethan? It wasn't alive. When did he come along, King James? 1600, late 1500, 1600. 1620 is when the King James Version was actually published, and he authorized that a couple of years prior to that. So King James is not one of the Jameses in the Bible. So if you've got a King James Version, I guess he's just on the front of it. Maybe that's the 6th when we're kind of looking for it. But let's look at who these men are. One of them, let's go to Luke 6:16. This is just kind of so you recall, Jesus choosing the 12, and in verse 16 it comes down, it says, Judas, the son of James. Okay, so James, one of the apostles, Judas. Well, there are 2 apostles named Judas, or one Judas, one Jude. But one of them, his father was James. This is the only reference we have to him, to this particular James. I think over in Acts 1, it kind of repeats this name for him. Acts 1:13. This is kind of another list. When they went to the upper room, so you're familiar with this, where they were staying, that is Peter and John and James. This James would be a different James, and Andrew, Philip and Thomas, Bartholomew and Matthew, James the son of Alphaeus, Simon the Zealot, and Judas the son of James. And so that last James there, this is 3 of the James, all in one verse, which is just kind of amazing. And what is the... you all know what the name James is anglicized from? Jacob. Okay, and if you read the Greek throughout the New Testament and you come across James, you're going to find the name Iacobus. Okay, Jacob. So this is really, Jacob was kind of the name, and we call it James. I don't know why they did it that way. No idea. But, anyway, this first James that we're going to talk about, the father of Judas, this is all we know about him. Okay, pretty minor character. And then there is James, the son of Alphaeus, and we just saw him in Acts 1:13 there. He's also mentioned, okay, got the other things there, Matthew, Mark, Luke, In Mark 15:40, turn over there. Mark 15, verse 40. There are also some women looking on from a distance. This is at the crucifixion. Among whom were Mary Magdalene, and Mary the mother of James the Less, and Joseph and Salome, or Salome. So James the Less, I think, is probably a reference to this James the son of Alphaeus. Okay.
Maybe that's where one of your fifth and sixth come from.
Could be.
I don't know.
Could be. When you call somebody James the Less, it kind of raises the question, well, if he's James the Less, who's James the Greater? Well, a third James, the Apostle James, James and John, okay, the two brothers, sons of Zebedee. Turn over to Matthew 4, is when he kind of first comes on the scene. Now we're getting into somebody who we've got some information about, though. And so we finally, there's a little bit more meat here. He was a fisherman. Matthew 4, verse 21. This is a narrative about Jesus choosing his first disciples. And going on from there, he, Jesus, saw two other brothers, James, the son of Zebedee, and John, his brother, in the boat with Zebedee, their father, mending their nets. And he called them. And they immediately left the boat and their father and followed him. And so he is a fisherman. Was. Ethan? Okay.
Just a question about James the Less, because I don't know if it's like if it's saying like he's lesser than the apostles. I know in the ESV it says James the Younger.
The younger. Okay.
So I don't know.
Yeah. I didn't look at it in the ESV. I've been using my New American Standard for this one, so.
I was just curious.
Yeah. I don't know.
Translation difference or
Translator difference.
Yeah, that's right.
They made a different decision when they got to that word. So, let's see. So he's a partner in a business with their father. And Simon is another partner in the business, apparently, from Luke 5 and Luke 6. You can kind of put all these things together to see who this fellow was. Along with his brother John, they're called the Sons of Thunder, or Boanerges, if you look in, I think the King James says that. And that's in Mark 3:17. This is the, let's look at that real quick. 3:17. James the son of Zebedee, John the brother of James, to them he gave the name Boanerges, which means sons of thunder. Okay? Very boisterous men, maybe. These are the two that wanted to call down hellfire and brimstone in this village because they wouldn't accept Jesus, okay? So it gives you a little bit of an insight into his character. What do we know about the character of John, or James, the son of Alphaeus? He seemed to be pretty faithful to Jesus as an apostle, as a disciple, but really not much else. When you read about James and John, you get a picture of just the type of men that they were. Another thing, hey, give us whatever we want. What do you want? We want to sit right at your right hand and left hand.
Yeah. But then see what the gospel did to John.
That's right. And
Son of Thunder became this,
yeah, and we'll see what the gospel did to James too.
Yeah.
Here in just in a minute. He was also, this is the James when it talks about Peter, James, and John went with Jesus, okay, the Mount of Transfiguration. This is the James. They went into, at one point, Jesus raised a little girl from the dead, right? Peter, James, and John. These three were with him, okay? So there's like this inner circle almost, a subset of these 12 apostles that he depended on these.
They ended up being the pillars of the church when they first started.
No.
They're not the same.
Not the same James. We'll get to that James in a moment here.
Okay.
And I said that, we'll see what the gospel did to him. Turn over to Acts 12. Acts 12. And verse 2. Starting 1. Now about the time Herod the king laid hands on some who belonged to the church in order to mistreat them, and he had James, the brother of John, put to death with a sword. Okay, so this is pretty early in the history of the church, all right? And Herod has him put to death with a sword. And so we know what his end is. This section, if we went on and read chapter 3, when he saw that it pleased the Jews, he proceeded to arrest Peter also during the days of unleavened bread. So he throws Peter into prison, and this is where in the middle of the night, the angel comes, wakes him up, leads him out of the prison, okay, brings him back. And if you jump down to, let's see, 17, but motioning to them, he goes to the house of Mary, knocks on the door. There's a servant girl, Rhoda, is it?
Yeah.
Done this, and she hears his voice, and she's so excited she runs away. And they finally open the door, but in 17 it says, but motioning to them with his hand to be silent, he described to them how the Lord had led him out of the prison. And he said, report these things to James and the brethren. And he departed and went to another place. And so Peter, at this point, is, kind of highlighting the importance of James, this fourth James we're going to talk about, in the early church. I mean, somebody taking on a little bit of a position of leadership. So, this Herod that put James, the son of the brother of John, to death would have been Herod Agrippa, and he would have been the grandson of Herod the Great. Right. And this probably happened about 44 AD. This James being put to death according to the International Standard Bible Encyclopedia. I don't know exactly how they got to that date, but so sometimes when you're reading through historical literature about these men, going through the historians and stuff, you'll see somebody referred to as James the Greater. This is probably the James that they're talking about when they talk about James the Great or James the Greater. So, the fourth one we're going to cover today is the James, the brother of the Lord, sometimes called James the Just by some of the early historians. Matthew 13. Let's see, verse 55. This is during Jesus' ministry, fairly early on. He coming to his hometown, he began teaching them in their synagogue, so they became astonished and said, "Where did this man get this wisdom and these miraculous powers?" So Jesus had shown him miracles. "Is not this the carpenter's son? Is not his mother called Mary, and his brothers James and Joseph and Simon and Judas?" So the brother James here is who we are talking about. The Judas there at the end is probably Jude, the author of the book of Jude. Okay, once we get to the book of Jude, we'll probably talk about that. So, in the list here in verse 55, he is the first of the brothers that's listed. So there's some conjecture that he is the oldest brother after Jesus. If one of the you have a family and one of the sons is misbehaving or something like that, and that was kind of the situation here. Or it was at some point where, hey, your brother's doing all this stuff. In fact, they kind of say he's gone off the deep end. Bring him here, and bring the family here, and straighten him out. So James may have been the next oldest brother after Jesus. This verse kind of puts to rest the perpetual virginity of Mary doctrine that is pushed by some faith backgrounds. I'll just say it that way. So let's see. So by the time that we talked about Acts 12, so Peter's in prison and is released, and then goes and back to the house, like I said, and says, "Hey, go tell James and the brethren." So there is again some sort of recognition that he's in kind of a leadership position at this point. And again, that would have been around 44 AD maybe. Acts 15, Galatians 2. You don't necessarily have to turn there. We have looked at this situation, a number of times as we have studied through, but there's a debate going on. How much do the Gentiles have to be a part of the law of Moses in order to be Christians? Okay. So there's this argument that Paul, when he writes the book of Galatians, and Galatians is probably one of the earliest letters ever written. And if there's something earlier than it, it might be the book of James. Okay. Paul writes this letter to the Galatians, and he's looking back to something that has happened in Antioch. Okay. And eventually that works its way into a question up to Jerusalem, for which they hold a council of church leaders and say, how do we resolve this? So in that, in Acts 15, Luke records Paul, right, saying they were reputed to be pillars. What verse is that? Or is that in Galatians 2? These two,
I think it's Galatians 2.
okay. These two sections kind of run together so closely, and you have to jump back and forth between them. This is after a break of 4. Galatians 2, verse 1, after an interval of 14 years, I went to Jerusalem with Barnabas, taking Titus along. Because of the revelation I went up, I submitted to them the gospel which I preach among the Gentiles, but I did so in private to those who were of reputation, for fear that I might be running, or had run, in vain. He goes on. Let's see, verse 9. And recognizing the grace that had been given to me, James and Cephas and John, who were reputed to be pillars, gave to me and Barnabas the right hand of fellowship. Okay. This James would have been James, the brother of the Lord, because the other James was beheaded by this time. So, let's see. Okay, and then in Galatians 2, and this is the chronology in Galatians 2. I always feel like it's just a little bit beyond my grasp every time I read through it, because I read through it one way, and I think I've got it down, then I read it again, and I think it has switched a little bit. If there's a section starting in verse 11, but when Cephas came to Antioch, I opposed him to his face because he stood condemned. You're familiar with this, okay? The most likely thing to me seems like that is what prompted kind of the questions back to the council in Jerusalem that are reported in verses 1 through 7 or 8. It seems to me like the council straightened things up, and then for Peter to come down afterwards and still refuse and begin to refuse eating with the Jews wouldn't make sense. Follow me?
Yeah, I do, but I don't see where the council would make any difference one way or the other. If he got caught up in the hypocrisy.
Yep. And the reason, why did he get caught up in the hypocrisy? Verse 12. Prior to the coming of certain men from James. Well, this is the James we're talking about. Okay? Now, did James send these men with this message, or did they come out with this message and claim to be from James?
I think your latter one is probably more right than the first one.
I think so too. You follow what I'm saying there? I don't think James sent them out, because when they got back there to ask about what's going on, now you're back in Acts 15, and in Acts 15, starting in verse 13, after they had stopped speaking, and so they've related what has gone on. Why do you put these people to a test that we ourselves could not bear? Okay, they're making the argument back and forth, and everybody's listening to Barnabas and Paul making the argument. After they had stopped speaking, James, this is the James, brother of the Lord, answered, saying, Brethren, listen to me. Simeon, Peter, has related how God first concerned himself about taking from among the Gentiles a people for his name. And with this, the words of the prophets agree, just as it is written, after these things I will return, I will rebuild the tabernacle of David, which is fallen. I will rebuild its ruins, and I will restore it, in order that the rest of mankind may seek the Lord, and all the Gentiles who are called by my name, says the Lord, who makes these things known from of old. Therefore it is my judgment that we do not trouble those who are turning to God from among the Gentiles, but that we write to them that they abstain from the things contaminated by idols, and from fornication, and from what is strangled, and from blood. For Moses, from ancient generations, has in every city those who preach him, since he is read in the synagogues every Sabbath. Did it seem good to the apostles and the elders and the whole church? And so they sent information back to Antioch to straighten up the situation. Okay? So, I don't think these men were from James. I think they claimed to be from James.
Right.
Okay? Or maybe misunderstood something that James had said. So, anyway, this James is right there in the thick of this, trying to work out this difficulty that has appeared in the early church. And, the whole thing about, is this for Gentiles also? If you've been raised and your family went back 1,000 years, okay, with a certain mindset, it would be very, very difficult to switch over to a new look at things. So, by the time of the council, Peter and James both seemed convinced that the law of Moses is dead. We do not have to hold that on to. It's not something that we should teach the Gentiles. They have to follow. So, okay. Those are a few of the internal things to talk about James. Okay, there are more things, and it gives us a little bit of an insight of kind of who he was and everything else. There's external evidence about James. Okay, is that? Oh, there you go. Okay, here's the things. There are some historical writers that mention James. Among them are Clement of Rome, Hegesippus. He was one of the earliest. Clement of Alexandria, Eusebius. You recognize the name Eusebius. They all mention James, the brother of the Lord, as being a leader of the church in Jerusalem. Okay. Not that he was the only leader or anything else, but Hegesippus says he spent so much time kneeled in prayer in the temple courts that his knees became calloused like that of a camel. I've talked about that before from up here. So this is the person James, and so praying for the people. This is the same one that wanted to call down. No, this is not the same one that wanted to call. So far as his death is concerned, Hegesippus reports that the scribes and the Pharisees took James to a wing of the temple. He was widely known and highly, highly respected even by the Jews. Okay, so they took him to a wing of the temple where he could apparently speak to everybody and kind of challenged him, saying, what about Jesus? And they were counting on him to recant. And he came out with this loud statement that was obvious that it wasn't. And they kind of conferred among themselves and said, we made a big mistake here. Pushed him off the wing of the temple. He fell down. Then they stoned him. And then a fuller beat his brains out with a club. And he was buried on the spot. That's some of the historical, outside the Bible, the historical writings from very, very early that talk about his demise. And that's supposed to have happened immediately before Vespasian invaded Judea. That happened somewhere 66, 69 AD. So we're talking 20, 25, 35 years or whatever that he was on the scene as a leader in the church. You recognize the name Josephus. And so one of the things that he says is the killing was done at the behest of Ananus, the high priest. Okay, this is not Ananias that you're familiar with, but a later on high priest. And he says there was enough of an uproar among even the Jews who held James in such high regard that what they did is they went and petitioned Herod to throw Ananus out of office. And so he was only in office for 3 months. So many people, even among the Jews, were upset because of the way that this was unlawfully done, that he was killed. So, let's see. And then, Josephus also says that when he talks about the siege of Jerusalem, he says, these things happened to the Jews to avenge James the Just, who was the brother of him who was called Christ, and whom the Jews had slain, notwithstanding his preeminent justice. So he's widely seen from both sides okay, the Christians and the Jews, as being a very just and holy person who did not deserve that kind of a death. So, and it's mostly accepted that this is the James who wrote the book of James, so the letter of James. And if you look at, let's turn over in there, James 1. He starts off in verse 1, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, to the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. Okay? Where in there does he mention, I'm the Lord's brother? Not at all. Not at all. Why would he not do that? I don't know that we know, but why might he not do that?
Well, I would go back to what Jesus said when his brothers and mother came to him. He said,
Okay.
Who are my brothers, my sisters, and mother and father?
Those that follow
do
me.
my will.
Yeah.
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 They are mine.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I mean, if we're followers of Christ, we are his brothers too. So being
Right.
being the physical brother of Christ probably didn't have much, or doesn't in the long run.
Right.
It doesn't really have much meaning.
Right. In the, I'm going to take it a little bit different way. In the, you've all heard of logical fallacies, okay? Errors in the way that we think, okay? The sunrise, or the cock crows, the sun rises, and we think, well, the cock crowing, because it happened first, must have caused the sun to rise, okay? The formal name of that fallacy is post hoc ergo propter hoc. It happened first, therefore it must have caused it. You guys have been talking about this, I can tell. Okay, so that's one logical fallacy. And so when we see somebody reasoning that way, we say that's invalid reasoning. This may be true and this may be true, but the idea that this caused this is completely separated. Yeah, it gets into, in statistics, the version of that in statistics has to do with correlation and causation, and John and I were talking about that for some reason this last week. Ice cream cone sales and drownings are highly correlated.
Really?
Yeah, because summertime, winter people at the beach, right? Okay, but one doesn't cause the other.
Right.
Okay. There is another logical fallacy out there called the appeal to authority. Okay? Do it this way because I said so. For James, I wonder if, do it this way, what I write, because I'm the Lord's brother. If he reports in verse 1, I'm the Lord's brother, so listen to what I say. Now, I think it's important to listen to what he says because he's the Lord's brother. But what if everything he said was against what the Lord had said? Well, then we wouldn't listen to him at all. And we'll see in a few minutes. It's not that way. Okay? But this appeal to authority. And so, sometimes you see debates. Well, I've got a PhD. Okay? But what you're saying may still be false. It may be true, and it may be false. And so it has to be evaluated on the merits of the evidence. Okay? That's what has to be. And so if he had appealed to the authority that he has as the brother of the Lord, he's going kind of beyond what needs to, because what he writes down is so good he doesn't need to appeal to that relationship. So, and it may be just a sense of, my brother was so great, I'm not even going to begin to compare myself to him out of humility. Okay, both a couple reasons that may be valid. So, but this is the James we're talking about. To whom was it written? Verse 1, just read it. To the 12 tribes who are dispersed abroad, greetings. Okay. Why wouldn't he address it to the local Jews? Is kind of the first question that comes to my mind.
Because the Jews were scattered everywhere. I don't know.
Well, they're already there to listen to him.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Right? You got a bunch of local people that you're telling stuff to. You don't need to write a letter to them. You write a letter to the people that aren't there. And so he's written to the Jews that are dispersed abroad. What other books are similar in this regard in the New Testament?
You're referring to
Hebrews.
Oh, okay.
Okay, the book of Hebrews is written to Hebrew Christians. Okay? This one is written to maybe Hebrew Christians also, but they have different purposes. Paul, I don't know who wrote Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews, and James seem to have different subjects in mind, different things that they're trying to get across. Okay, we'll talk about that in a little bit. There's no mention in this of Gentile believers. I mean, it doesn't apply? Of course not. But it does kind of make you wonder, as far as the date is concerned, what does the fact that he doesn't include Gentiles specifically could reinforce the idea that this is a very, very early letter that was written before a lot of the events of Galatians and Acts 15 really took place, because this is not a debate that was on the scene at the time.
Yeah, this
Okay.
possible before Acts 9. Christians were scattered everywhere.
Yeah.
They're gone.
Yeah. Yeah. So it's interesting. It definitely is targeted. He says to you guys, but we think it's probably one of the earlier ones. The manuscript, the earliest manuscript copy, mid-3rd century. Okay. The council, huh?
It's a ways back.
Yeah, it is. It is. And that's I think that's a full copy. Okay. There are fragments that go, I think, back into the 1st century. But a manuscript copy, the whole thing, mid-3rd century. Council of Jerusalem, Acts 15, around 50 AD, 49 AD, 50 AD, something like that. And again, no mention of the Galatians 2 and Acts 15 issues, so it may predate some of that. So, if the first James was killed in 44, and he was killed, this James was killed 66, 69, something like that. How long does it take for calluses to build up on your knees in prayer? Anybody know? We probably should, right? Okay. The subject. It's on practical matters. The whole thing is built on practical matters. How to live your life so you're pleasing to God.
Or the problems that were plaguing the congregation there. And likely if they're plaguing the congregation in Jerusalem, they're probably plaguing the congregation
Right. Right. Yeah. There's nothing new under the sun, right? If you guys are struggling with something, there's probably somebody else out there that's struggling with the same sort of thing, and so he's trying to handle those things. And those things would have been different things at different times too. As the church matured in the early years, there would have been some issues that continued to arise, and certainly one of the big ones was what about Gentiles that believe? What do we do here?
Discrimination.
So we want to contrast this with the book of Hebrews, and we're studying the book of Hebrews, so this is all very, very recent in our minds. What is the author's big point in the book of Hebrews?
The law of Moses doesn't forgive sin.
Doesn't what?
Forgive sin.
Doesn't forgive sin? Okay.
Good.
That is certainly an extremely important point. Is it the big point? I don't think it's the big point. What did you say?
I was saying a greater law or a greater way.
Okay. I've heard Hebrews called the book of better things.
Yeah.
Okay, you ever hear that?
Yeah.
Okay, you've got this, and Jesus is much better. You've got this, Jesus is much better. You've got this, Jesus is much better. Okay, so he's targeting an audience who is sliding back to this over here. He says, don't do it. This is better over here. Okay. James, he's kind of hitting the same target in terms of 12 tribes that are dispersed. Okay. But his point is completely different. In Hebrews, don't slide back. In James is saying, this is how you live over here. This is how you live your life. And so it becomes a very different tone of the book than what Hebrews does. There's not just the really tightly reasoned, perfectly logical arguments that are in Hebrews. They're just not there. They're just not there in James because it doesn't fit the purpose of what James is trying to accomplish in writing this letter. So it's the practical matters. Okay. And some miscellaneous items. There's only 108 verses in the book. half of them, I didn't count, somebody else did, and I'm referencing them, half of them have some sort of imperative, directive nature to them. So they have words in them like do this, do not do this, let us, okay, let us, let us is all over the place. So these are things that involve action, okay, involve doing. And this is kind of one of the reasons that at the time of the Reformation, Martin Luther and everything else, Luther said we shouldn't use that book at all because it says not by faith alone. Okay. Other places, Paul says we're saved by faith only. Well, they're using the words in little bit different ways, talking about different things and to different audiences. Those are compatible sorts of things. Because of the way it's written, it's been called the Proverbs of the New Testament. The word gospel doesn't appear in the book. The ideas behind the gospel even really do not appear. He takes those things, those are given sorts of things. Those are all worked out. He doesn't need to address those. He's trying to accomplish something else. It's what after somebody has already heard this and made a decision, now, how do you live your life? So, there's only 2 or 3 references to Jesus, even in the book. Chapter 1, verse 1, James, a bondservant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ. That's one of them. Chapter 2, verse 1, my brethren, do not hold your faith in our glorious Lord Jesus Christ with an attitude of personal favoritism. I can't find another. I suspect there's another one there somewhere. Because that is not there, detractors look at that and say, it's not a legitimate letter. This is a really good letter that was out there beforehand. One of the early Christians took it and added 2 verses about Jesus and claimed it was Scripture. That's a pretty thin argument.
Yeah.
But that, detractors will do a lot of things. Was it Thursday night? Thursday night, he showed something about one of the arguments that were made on the Skeptics, International Skeptics Bible, and how it had been refuted. And it was so easy to refute. Just look at the context. An attack like that can kind of sound legitimate. There's no evidence for it, but it can kind of sound legitimate at first.
Isn't James one of the books that Jefferson just
I don't know.
threw out?
I don't know. I'm not sure. Thomas Jefferson, what he's referring to there, Thomas Jefferson took a Bible and with a razor cut out all the miracles. Okay, cut out all the miracles. And I don't know if it was just in the Gospels or the rest of it too, because he didn't believe that. He thought those things were added later on. So I've got a copy of the Jefferson Bible at home, I think. Yeah.
I think Martin Luther said something about which James wasn't there.
Yeah. And it was based on the idea of it's saying faith without works is dead. Okay. Now, James's point in this faith without works, and we'll get to that in a couple months or whatever, but the faith without works is the idea that if you're faithful, works will flow out of that. And if there are no works flowing out of that, your faith is a dead faith, and a dead faith can't do anything. Okay? So, Luther was aiming at people who were claiming that, no, you got to earn your way to heaven, you got to earn your way to heaven, you got to earn your way to heaven. That's what was going on in the Catholic Church. And so Luther's fighting against that idea. And it goes to the other extreme. Well, when you go to the extreme on either end, there's probably something missing there. And there was. And so he would toss out the entire book. So, but then I think there are other places where he quotes it. It's Scripture. So I hope I am more consistent than that. We all see other things, I suppose. This next slide, you're not going to be able to read it, I'm afraid. But this is from the Nelson's Complete Book of Bible Maps and Charts. This shows a parallel between the ideas in James and the ideas in the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Oh, there it is. Can you see it? Marcus, can you see that guy? So, this is the verses in James that the ideas seem to come from the Sermon on the Mount, and then the subjects are over on the right-hand side. Okay? You follow what's going on there? Do you think that maybe James had an idea of what the teachings of Jesus were when he wrote this letter? And he was familiar with these things? Now, at the point of the Sermon on the Mount, I don't think James was a believer. Okay? My brother's gone off his rocker. By the end of his life, though, he's in a very different position. Okay? Very, very different understanding. So, I found that a rather interesting.
Is one of your entries up there in Greek?
What's that?
It's like seventh line down or so, what is that one right there?
Oh, it's just cut off.
Oh, you cut the top off. Religious person whose
Well, I'm not
Worthless.
whose religion is worthless. Yeah. I scanned that, and I don't really know how to use my scanner to adjust it for high fidelity or whatever it's called. But these are the kinds of practical things. So you read through the Sermon on the Mount, there's a whole lot of practical teaching right in there. James mirrors a lot of that. So ultimately, the author is God.
God, that's very good. One rather than the same, right?
That's right. Same person wrote both. Okay. We've got 2 minutes. That's not enough to read the book. So we'll stop right here and start on the hour. And thank you for your attention, everyone.